Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to our second session of the Africana Muslim and Genealogies of White Supremacy Sawyer Seminar for the Interdisciplinary Study of Blackness and Muslimness. The seminar, led by Professors Suad Abdel Khabir, Samir Ali, and myself, aims to address the way the racialized figure of the Africana Muslims from Africa and its diasporas, has been hyper visible in the theory and practice of racism since the days of Columbus, yet has been largely invisible in scholarship on critical race studies, white supremacy, and Middle East studies. Over the course of the year, the seminar will bring together leading scholars, thinkers, and activists to reconceptualize the study of the African and the Muslim and recenter the Africana Muslim beyond the cracks of traditional disciplines and narratives. Our goal is to trace the intersection of race and religion in the production and reproduction of white supremacy in both theory and praxis. The seminar is supported by the Mellon Foundation, and it's housed at our home institution, the University of Michigan, the origins of which are a land grant from the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, and the Wyandot. Our university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained in unconscionable ways from indigenous peoples. Knowing where we are changes neither the past nor the present. However, through scholarship and pedagogy, we work to create a future in which the past is thoroughly understood and the present supports human flourishing and justice while enacting an ethic of care and compassion. Today, Session 2, Plantations, aims to generate a wide-ranging reflection on questions and themes raised by plantations by way of the theory and lived experience of the Africana Muslim. The session explores plantations as a site for the economic, political, social, and affective orders that emerge from construction and reproduction of plantations from the Americas to the Indian Ocean region. Examining the plantation as a site, as opposed to slavery as a phenomenon, enables scholars to see and analyze the convergence of slavery with capitalist exploitation of land and labor, and the expropriation of land by colonial conquest. Our session aims to address the contexts, structures, and afterlives of capitalist exploitation and land appropriation that were central, and the relationship of power between slave owner and the enslaved, settlers and natives that were raced, classed, gendered, and religious and formal and intimate. Scholars such as Sylvia Winter, Clyde Woods, and Catherine McKittrick have described the plantation as one of the key sites of modernity. What happens to this site and the modernity it represents when we examine it as a space in which the Muslim, the African, and the Africana Muslim were racialized and resisted that racialization by imagining worlds otherwise? Our first session, which was comprised of a panel and a keynote, was devoted to prisons, and you can find it on our YouTube channel. Our future sessions include discussions of courts, media culture, which will be on February 28th, theory and the production of knowledge on April 28th, and much more. Today, we have a two-part event. The first is a keynote delivered by Dr. Michael Gomez, which will be from now until 1 p.m. At 1:30, we'll reconvene for a panel featuring Drs. Margarita Lila Rosa, Jason Young, and Nathaniel Matthews, with Dr. Elia Khan and Dr. Gomez offering comments. So without further ado, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Michael Gomez. Dr. Gomez is currently Silver Professor of History in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University and the Director of NYU's Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora, having served as the founding director of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora from its inception in 2000 to 2007. He is also the founding editor of the Cambridge Studies on the African Diaspora and the general editor of its Cambridge History of the African Diaspora, a 3-volume series scheduled for 2025. He has chaired the history departments at both NYU and Spelman College, and was president of UNESCO's International Scientific Committee for the Slave Route Project from 2009 to 2011. His first book, Pragmatism in the Age of Jihad, the Pre-Colonial State of Bundu, came out in 1992, and it examines a Muslim polity in what is now eastern Senegal. The next publication, Exchanging Our Country Marks, the Transformation of African Identities in the Colonial and Antebellum South, is concerned with questions of culture and race. The edited volume, Diasporic Africa, The Reader, came out in 2006 and is more fully involved with the idea of an African diaspora, as is Reversing Sail, A History of the African Diaspora, first out in 2005 and again in 2019. The monograph Black Crescent, African Muslims in the Americas came out in 2005, and it explores the experiences of African Muslims in bondage and freedom throughout the Americas. It integrates Islamic Africa into the analysis. Dr. Gomez's most recent book, African Dominion, A New History of Empire in Early and Medieval West Africa, came out with Princeton in 2018. It is a comprehensive study of polity and religion during the region's most iconic moment. It was awarded the 2019 African Studies Association's Book Prize, as well as the 2019 American Historical Association's Martin A. Klein Prize in African History. Dr. Gomez is also the lead scholar and editor of the 2-volume Hidden Voices, Stories of the Global African Diaspora, which came out through the New York City Department of Education in 2023 and 2024. Here, he helped design for secondary school instructors 2 incredible resources. He is also a recipient of the American Historical Association's 2023 Award for Scholarly Distinction. And Dr. Gomez supports the struggles of African people worldwide, and we are so delighted, so thrilled to have him here with us today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Gomez.
Thank you so much, Murad, and I want to thank all of the organizers and the conveners for inviting me to participate with you in this exploration of this theme. And I apologize for the lengthy introduction. So we don't have a lot of time. So I want to get to some of this, but it's going to be, obviously it's going to be a survey, but obviously there will be some argument involved here. So let's see how it goes. In 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the ocean blue, and with him came Islam. Among his crews were Muslims who had been forced to profess the Christian faith, but it is highly probable that Islam remained embedded in the soul. To these and others were added enslaved Africans in the 15th and 16th centuries, some of whom were also Muslim. Through the 19th century, the number of African Muslims transported to the Americas continued to grow. So what I want to talk about at this point represents a kind of synopsis of their experiences, both Africans, African descendant Muslims in the Americas, through the end of slavery as a legal category. Put more succinctly, enslaved African Muslims were distributed throughout the Americas and were either more numerous or more organized as a community in the Caribbean and Brazil than in what became the U.S. Islam as an African importation would falter in the first 2 regions, whereas it emerges as an important social and political force in the United States in the 20th century. The overall Muslim experience in the whole of the Americas is a curious, has a curious or even unpredictable pattern relative to period and region. Let me explain. In the 15th and 16th centuries, and in lands claimed by Spain, Muslims developed a reputation as highly rebellious. In the 17th and 18th centuries, although Islam was still suspect, the image of Muslim recalcitrance was replaced by one of superior caste relative to non-Muslim Africans, often resulting in their preferential treatment in both Lusophone and Spanish-speaking areas. The 19th century will see the return of their reputation as rebels in Brazil, where they were seen as a menacing presence and from the state received corresponding attention in kind. In significant contrast, Muslims in the Caribbean and North America in the 18th and 19th centuries were comparatively quiet and compliant, and again distinguished from other enslaved persons, with individuals even celebrated in a qualified sense, and they were again afforded differential treatment. In North America, their legacy survived a temporal interim until the early 20th century, when the fortunes of Islam were revived by way of the rise of nationalist sentiment. Although by no means the only ones to do so, early leaders of Islamic-like movements forged indissoluble bonds with nationalist expressions, providing a vehicle through which certain Islamic ideas could be introduced and disseminated. Regarded as unorthodox by many, such movements reached the height of their popularity under Malcolm X, whose eventual embrace of orthodoxy in the form of Sunni Islam paved the way for the many to follow. So in my view, closure of this circle and the reattachment to a form of Islam more closely resembling the religion of African forebears owes a great deal to the pioneers of theologies at variance with the conventional. Now, the evidentiary base for what we know about the African Muslim experience in the Americas during the period of enslavement, during this plantation period, from the late 15th through the end of the 19th century, is informed by at least three different types of empirical sources. The first concerns the antecedent African context, and the key to understanding that context is periodization. The second source of information is more inferential in that it consults with slave trade databases. For our purposes, the slaving records point to the critical regions and ports of exit. Beyond providing quantitative data, differential flows can be correlated to what we know about particular historical developments in both hinterland and littoral, thus providing insights into what communities were involved in the slaving process on both sides of the ledger. That is to say, who was being captured and who was doing the capturing. The third leg of the triad is the collective testimony gathered from sources in the Americas. Plantation records, traveler observations, runaway slave advertisements, annals of revolt, biographical and autobiographical accounts, artistic drawings, renderings, sketches, written documentation in Arabic script, some in fact Arabic, some Ajami, evidence from other forms of material culture, wakatha wakatha. Altogether, the collective record suggests that throughout the 19th century, the African Muslim experience or the African Muslim presence in the Americas represents a variegated picture and therefore one of the more fascinating dimensions of the enslaved experience. So here I'm going to share my screen or attempt to share my screen. I want to, okay, let's see if this is, okay, I think I'm sharing my screen with you now. And I want to draw your attention to this whole business about how we know what we know from about Muslims in this period or during this experience. So here I'm drawing upon a map that can be found in what we used to call the Du Bois database. I think it's just simply called Slave Voyages now. And so you will see here representations, relative representations of numbers, of the relative number of people who are drawn from the African continent into the Americas by way of the slave trade. And of these areas, Senegambia, Sierra Leone, Windward Coast, Gold Coast, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, Southeast Africa, um, most of the Muslims who will come into the Americas are coming from Senegambia, uh, Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, Bight of Benin. You have very few who are coming from, oh, there's the presence of Muslims in West Central Africa is basically non-existent. As opposed to Southeast Africa, this is the Swahili coast, where the Muslim presence is very significant and had been very significant since the 12th century of the Common Era, but from which very few Africans actually find their way into the Americas. All right, so we need to keep that in mind. So we're basically talking about four areas, yeah, from which Africans are, sorry, Muslims are being recruited, to use a euphemistic term, into the Americas. So this gives us some sense of what's happening. And also, let me just say, as an aside, I know that there are several scholars who attempt to provide numerical value, that is to say, to estimate the number of African Muslims who come into the Americas. And I do shy away from that. I'm not at all confident in those kinds of speculations. I applaud those who uh, who have the courage to do so, but it's not an area uh, into which I journey. I mean, an estimate of 10 to 15% of all of the Africans transported into the Americas. So that would be 10% of 12.5 million Africans. Well, 12.5 exported, about 10.8 or about 11 million imported. So we're talking about probably over a million. I'm comfortable with that, but I have my reservations, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you would like to do so. So this is a general map of areas from which Africans in general come. Now I want to kind of overlay that, if I can, with a map of that represents the rise of important Muslim-led polities in West Africa, all of which were in the interior, all of which were in the hinterland. And here what we have is a situation in which the periodization becomes very, very important. By way of summary, this is a long period. This is a 400-year period from the 15th through the 19th centuries through which Africans are being transported into the Americas. The practice of Islam, the presence of Islam, is, and there's something in the chat. I guess I need to find out what's happening there. My apologies. Let's see if I'm doing something right or wrong. Oh, okay. All right. So I'm good. So the presence and practice of Islam changes and is variegated depending upon the specific West African region under consideration, and the period. This is important for you to understand. So, in the 15th and 16th centuries, we're talking about a moment in time in which the Songhai Empire is still around. Mali is in decline. These are areas which basically cover the Niger Valley. This area here, I'm trying to represent that with this arrow. These are medieval empires. They are more oriented toward trade with the Maghreb, with North Africa and the Mediterranean than they are with the Atlantic, quite simply because the Portuguese do not begin to circumnavigate the West African coast until the middle of the 15th century. So the Portuguese will slowly begin to circumnavigate the West African coast beginning in the middle of the 15th century. All right. So it's during the 15th into the 16th century, right, that trading patterns begin to shift, not fully away from the Sahara. Those commercial networks continue to exist well into the 20th century. But without question, more and more activity will be directed toward the Atlantic. So this is a gradual kind of process. So that in the 15th and 16th centuries, you have Muslims largely coming from the Senegambia region, right? And they are, but not everyone in the Senegambia region is Muslim. And furthermore, it's not clear the type of Islam that people are practicing. So, because there are multiple kinds of influences here. These people are those who move into the trade, either for the most part through the Atlantic, are winding up in Andalus, in Iberia, in either Spain and Portugal. And their experiences those experiences in Andalus or Iberia will be transferred into the Americas. That's 15th, 16th century. And so this is a period in time in which Islam is slowly moving into West Africa by way of trade. Potentates, rulers are converting. By Songhai is a Muslim-led empire until its fall in 1591. Over in this area here, this would be northern Nigeria, currently northern Nigeria. This is Hausaland. All of the rulers of the major city-states of Katsina, Kanu, and so forth. These are Muslims by the 15th century. We know less about the peasantry in these areas. And what types of religions they were practicing. Yeah. So what we can say is that so Islam is in sub-Saharan Africa, in this part of sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, as early as the 8th, 9th centuries. It's slowly moving. It's closely associated with trade. This continues on, right, until we get to a period in the 18th century. This period of West African history is known as the Age of Jihad, literally, holy war. And this is what you see represented on this map. And so what you have at this moment, 18th, 19th centuries, are the rise of theocracies. And this is something that I don't know if it anticipates, but it certainly antedates what happens with the Ayatollah Khomeini in what becomes Iran. That is to say, in West Africa in the 18th and 19th century, what you have are clerics who are leading polities. And these are reform movements, and they result in the creation of Muslim polities. You have in the middle of the Senegal Valley, Futa Toro. You have further south in what is now Guinea, in the highlands, in the Massif of Guinea, Futa Jalon. Actually, Futa Jalon uh, begins in the 1720s as a Muslim polity, Futa Toro in the 1770s. And then you have in the 19th century, moving all the way over into what is now Northern Hausaland, the creation of the Sokoto Caliphate, which, with all intentionality, attempts to mimic the Abbasid Caliphate. And this is by way of a jihad that's led by Usman Danfodio from 1804 to 1812, results in the Sokoto Caliphate. You see the uh, the uh, the spatial representation of this movement in northern Nigeria and even into what is now southern Nigeria, into the Yoruba area. Yeah. And then so this is 1804 to 1812. And then in the middle of the 19th century, you have the Omarian state that is created by Al-Hajj Omar. This is what is now Western Mali. And then you have the establishment of the of the Al-Mamad of Hamdullahi in what is Massina in the middle of the Niger floodplain. So what you see here, and there are other reform movements which take place in West Africa, but these are the major ones. So what is the point? The point here is that the Muslims who are coming into Iberia and then from Iberia to the Americas are coming out of a very different experience than what takes place in the 18th and 19th century. And the Muslims who are coming into the Americas in the 18th and 19th centuries are coming out of a context of conflict, of war. They're coming also out of a conflict in which all of these movements are led by clerics who are either Tijaniya or Qadiriya. So the Tariqa, the Turuk, the brotherhoods have become very, very important in West Africa. And to this day, until recently, by and large, the Islam of West Africa is characterized by involvement with the Tariqa. And so whether we're talking about the Tijaniya or the Qadiriya or the Muradiya, yeah, this characterizes Sufism characterizes much of West African Islam. So this is important to understand. I'm asking you to take this into consideration. And I understand that everyone is not on board with Sufism, and so that's for another time, right? Okay, so I want to now, let's see, where am I at here? So that gives you some context, and I want to go back to what I was saying and give you some and provide some some narrative, if I may. Okay, so I don't think I'm sharing my screen any longer. Is that the case? Okay, so I will continue. So let's now. So I've tried to give you some background with respect to the West African context. It's very important to keep this in mind. So now let's turn and focus on, in fact, what's happening in the Americas. So if we begin with what becomes Spanish-speaking Americas, the Iberian context is critical, because as opposed to what happens in Anglophone North America, where the meeting of Africans and the English was very novel, even startling. The engagement between Africans and Europeans in what becomes Latin America was in many ways an extension of this interaction that began hundreds of years earlier in Iberia, North Africa, and elsewhere in the Mediterranean. So as we know, Muslim expansion into Andalus begins in 711. This lasts for nearly 800 years until Granada's fall in 1492. Muslim conquerors, as we know, will introduce or reintroduce, in some instances, scientific, religious, classical studies, along with architectural innovations, a quality of civilization, both unique and superior to much of what was current in Europe. So to the Portuguese and the Spanish, they were well acquainted with Muslims in Iberia. And what happens is the creation of a diverse assembly of differentiated unequals that will include Arabs, Berbers, Arabo-Berbers, and West Africans, because West Africans are there as well. Together, they will comprise this unwieldy and heterogeneous category that Europeans refer to as Moors. Now, the Spanish use of the term Moor in the 16th century was not necessarily a reference to race, as we currently understand it. Indeed, Berbers and Arabs had extensive quote unquote contact with Black people. And but rather more, in my estimation, should be understood in this period in time as a casta, as opposed to a nación, which is a designation that doesn't necessarily imply a racial factor as much as a cultural characteristic that has to do with Islam. So Africans, including so-called sub-Saharan Africans, were present in Iberia. And they will actually seize control of parts of the peninsula with the Almoravids in the 11th century. And just kind of moving on, this establishes the antecedent for what takes place with respect to the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. This is brought about, as we know, as a consequence of the Christian unification of Iberia under the Portuguese and the Spaniards. And so you have an end to conflict in the Mediterranean, and you also have an end to a cessation of conflict in the Black Sea region, where the Byzantines are overthrown, establishing the basis for what later becomes the Ottoman Empire, later in the 15th century. This creates the need for labor with the quote unquote discovery of the Americas. And so consequently, the sub-Saharan African in particular, gets involved, becomes recruited, again, euphemistically, to provide for this labor. And this is taking place in conjunction with what some anthropologists refer to as the Great Dying, which has to do with Aboriginal populations in the Americas, in some instances coming near extinction, in other instances rebounding in subsequent centuries. But there is a need for labor, and the African will provide this need for labor. The Portuguese will provide the Spaniards with African labor, Most of the West Africans sold by the Portuguese in Spain after 1462 were known. They were called Negros de Jollof or Jolofes. This is a reference to the Empire of Jollof near the Senegal River in Senegambia. But given the Portuguese area of operation, this would include all Africans from Senegambia to Sierra Leone. By the end of the 15th century, the Jolofes were joined by a group of people known as the Mandingas, in the Portuguese Mandingas. And these are Mande speakers. And subsequently, you will have another group that the Portuguese and the Spanish refer to as the Bantus. And so these are people coming out of West Central Africa. So the point here is that the people who are the so-called Jolofes, the term Jollofe refers to an amalgam of people. The Wolof speakers, the Pular speakers call themselves Halpularan. They're referred to variously as Fulani, Fulbe, Tukulor. All of these people refer to themselves as Halpularan, speakers of Pular. Mande speakers, various Mande languages, all of these people are referred to as Jolofes. These are the people who will be brought into the Americas. And once again, not all of these people are Muslim. I don't know that we can really, if we have a real grasp of just what percentage of these populations are Muslim in the 15th and 16th century, they're certainly there. But they come into what is now Dominican Republic, Panama, other places, sites in the Caribbean, Central America, and we have evidence that some of them were Muslim from a number of sources, including records from the Portuguese Inquisition. And by the way, the Inquisition records are excellent sources for uncovering the African experience during this period, 15th, 16th centuries. So these people will develop a reputation for rebellion. And they are constantly rebelling. And this is 15th, 16th century. Yeah. There's a kind of, it's interesting. As you read the sources, the Spanish sources and the Portuguese sources for the 17th and 18th centuries, what becomes clear is that Muslims are still seen as, they're still suspect coming out of this Iberian experience. They're still suspect, but there's not a lot of discussion about rebellion associated with these Muslims until we get to Brazil. And it's in the early 19th century that we begin to read about these very serious rebellions taking place, in particular in the captaincies of Pernambuco and Bahia in northeastern Brazil. Of course, the most famous was that of Palmares, which was not a Muslim movement, and it will last for basically the whole of the 17th century. But when we come to the 19th century, we begin to see a series of rebellions led by Muslims in Pernambuco and in particular Bahia. And they end most famously with the Malay revolt in Bahia. All right, I wanted to show you just a few things here, and then I'm running out of time, so my apologies. I want to show you something here. So here we get into material culture, and this was a document that was carried by, so the term Malay we conjecture that the term Malay comes from a Yoruba term for Muslims that refers all the way back to Mande speakers from the Malian Empire. And so we have a significant uh, uh, amount of written materials from Bahia by these people who were by Muslims who were involved in rebellion in the capital city of Salvador. And so this was a book. It's a compilation of surah and personal observations and so forth. Some of it is in Ajami, some of it is in Arabic. And so I just wanted to show you that. And also I wanted to show you that these Muslims in Salvador were Sufis, and as Sufis, they carried amulets. And the amulets that they carried, a number of them still exist to this day. They're in the archives and the libraries in Brazil. And these are just some examples of some of the amulets that were recovered from 1835. And obviously, the amulet the West African amulet involved, Muslim amulet involved writing a surah on a piece of paper and putting it in a pouch, and then the person would wear it upon his or her body for various purposes, protection in particular, in war and that type of thing. And these were very popular. They were very popular in West Africa, and they were being used in the Americas as well. And so these are just examples of some of them. These things were called bolsas de mendiga in Brazil. Bolsas de mendiga, mande purses, manding pouches, if you will. And so these were very, very typical. And these amulets, or as they're referred to in some instances as grigri in West Africa, were removed from people who were involved in revolt. The 1835 revolt in Brazil was severely repressed in Bahia, severely repressed in 1835. And what we now know is that so a number of Muslims were either sent back to West Africa, some were imprisoned, a number were killed. But those who survived that revolt would move further south in Brazil. And so scholars are now uncovering the evidence for the existence of significant Muslim communities, a significant Muslim community in Rio de Janeiro. And so this work is ongoing. Now, I want to turn my attention to, so I've been talking about Latin America, and now I need to talk. So we don't have a lot of time. What I can say, this is a vast, vast topic, so my apologies. This is a vast topic. In the Caribbean, there are Muslim communities. In Trinidad, in Jamaica, we have evidence of Muslims who were participatory in the Haitian Revolt, 1791 to 1804. So the Muslim communities were there. What we can say about the Muslim communities in the Caribbean is that they were very intentional about if they were brought as enslaved persons into the Caribbean, they were assiduous in their efforts to obtain their freedom. They often purchased their freedom. They purchased the freedom of other Muslims. They formed communities. They practiced the religion. And with the transition from slavery to freedom between 1834 and 1838 by the British, a number of them sent petitions to England to be repatriated to West Africa. Not everyone made it. As a matter of fact, many did not. But they did petition on several instances to return to West Africa. Relative to other enslaved populations or other African descendant populations, these communities were fairly successful. They became property owners. They were involved in agriculture, to some extent trade, so forth and so on. These communities do not survive in the Caribbean. That is to say, obviously you have significant Muslim communities in the Caribbean as we now speak, but the connection to the 19th century is fraught. It cannot be clearly made. In a place like Trinidad and Tobago, you have a subsequent movement of Muslims from the Indian subcontinent into that place. And there were some relations between Indian Muslim communities, African Muslim communities in places like Trinidad and Tobago. Those things are still being examined. Okay, which brings us to North America. Okay, I've spent all this time talking about elsewhere. There is evidence for for Muslims. I won't say they were a community, but there's evidence of Muslims in the New York area, and during the Dutch period. And these Muslims were not from West Africa for the most part. They were from Madagascar and the Swahili coast. There were not a lot of them. And most of the evidence for African Muslims in what becomes the U.S. comes from the Georgia, South Carolina littoral, in the Sea Islands there, places like Sapelo and so forth and so on, where important Muslim communities existed, 18th, 19th centuries. We have a lot of evidence for their existence and for a serious attempt to practice Islam. Now, I'll conclude here because I write in Black Crescent that the argument I'm making there is that what takes place in the early 20th century with subsequent developments in North America connect these earlier African Muslims to subsequent Muslims in the 20th century. And so that's something that people can accept or reject. That's for another time. So I think I need to stop because we only have 10 minutes.
Right.
And so my apologies, I've just barely touched.
Yes.
But there's so much to talk about.
Right. No, there is so much to talk about. And thank you so much for that. I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm thinking to myself, so you need more time. We can just sit here. I mean, it's just there's so much there that you've been covering and so much you've done. So it's fantastic. And one of the things that stood out for me the most, which I thought I really appreciated, was this notion of period, right? And periodization. So this idea that I think sort of today we think of even slavery, right? We think of it as this kind of this period is all the same thing, right? It's all the same thing in the same time in the same place. And in fact, right, 15th century, 18th century are not the same things, right? Enslaved African Muslims are not having the same experiences. They don't have the same kind of Muslim identities, right? There's a real kind of sort of, to use the word diversity, so to speak, right? That depends on the time and place where people are coming from. And so one of the questions that came up that I wanted to ask you in relationship to that was, so you opened up talking about this idea of, depending if they were in the Spanish colonies or North America, and this idea of Muslims being seen as rebellious versus compliant, right? And I wondered, because I know one of the things people talk about a lot in terms of historical research is that the documents that we tend to have are not those by the people themselves, right? It's by the people who didn't believe they were human, right? So I'm wondering how you contend with that. How do you even understand what does compliance mean, right, like in this kind of context? How do we make those determinations? So that was one question that came up.
Okay, a very good question. And so for the 15th and 16th century, um, I deduce, the kind of, collective approach to enslavement from the actions that these people took. So yes, you're absolutely right. What we have for the 15th and 16th century in Spanish claimed lands are accounts of rebellion. We have accounts of rebellion. But in a number, and so that in a number of, so these people are rebelling in that they are either fighting, they're actually fighting, they're taking up weapons and fighting the Spanish, or they are running away and they're forming maroon communities in Panama, in Dominican Republic, and so forth. There are a lot of these. And so they're clearly trying to get away from Spanish authority.
Mhm.
It's the Spanish who characterize them as being rebellious. So much so that at one point, slaveholders in Spanish claimed lands, they write back to the central authority and say, don't send us any more of these jalofis. They're too rebellious. Send us people from West Central Africa. We can work with these people, but I mean, but these Muslims, we can't, they won't follow instruction. They're running away. They're fighting. They're taking up. Okay. So that sense of their approach comes from those types of records. Now, when we get to this question of compliance, and let me just say that I was very surprised when I went into this research, and this research goes back decades, but I went into this assuming that the record of the Muslim experience in the Americas would be entirely oppositional. I just did not find that. I did not find
Mhm.
that. And so what I found was that in periods that I refer to in particular in the 18th and 19th centuries in the Caribbean and in North America, I do not see records of, I don't see any indication of Muslims organizing revolt. I don't see it.
Mhm. Mhm.
What I do see, and I think that a number of these Muslims were organizing themselves according to, and I'm looking into this, but according to some of the instruction that you find in the Muwatta of Malik ibn Anas.
Mhm.
I think that they are organizing themselves in that way so that they buy each other's freedom.
Mhm.
They do their best, right, to establish Quranic schools, to pursue literacy, uh, wakada wakada. And it's 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 a response to a period of slavery that is not necessarily trying to overthrow slavery itself, but
Mhm.
rather is focusing on the well-being of the Muslim community.
Wow, that's
So
very
that's
interesting.
what I mean by compliance.
Okay.
Now, finally, because I know we're running out of time. When we come to the 19th century in Bahia, those people are coming out of Beit Benin. Those people are coming out of a context of war. So when they come to Bahia, these are soldiers. These are warriors who have been captured in war. And my strong sense, and here I have differed with the principal author of the study on the Malay Revolt, Joao Hayes, and I think Joao has come around to my understanding of things, My
Mhm.
position is that people are coming out of that context and they are trying to recreate in Bahia, and it's some kind of an extension of a caliphate. That's my sense of things. So even in that situation, the Muslim community is after something other than just being anti-slavery. They are trying to
Mhm.
create an alternative, an alternate community. And in that case, my strong sense is that they're trying to create a different polity in Brazil. In
Mhm.
Brazil.
So, yeah. I think that's really profound what you're saying too, because I think about this in terms of just not so one, right? I think in generally speaking, when we talk about enslaved Africans, Muslim or not, right, this question of rebellion, resistance is a theme, right? And people always trying to figure out, well, how are people doing this? And I think, and today in our current right context with the descendants of Africans, right, enslaved in this, it's a similar thing, right? Like, how do you respond to these systems of oppression, right?
Yes.
Rebellion is an option, right? But there's also this idea of taking care of each other, right? And
Yes.
while we're dealing with this, and then this idea of alternate ways, right? To sort of kind of imagine how we might live. So I think that I really appreciate that sort of the way that history really, I think, kind of also helps us think about the present. I think that's really powerful in that way. And we're gonna give ourselves a couple more minutes because there's one more question that came
Okay.
that I wanted to that's related to this point, and I think also that would be a nice way for us to end.
Yeah.
So the question is, can you talk more about your choice to distinguish mid-20th century Black Muslim nationalists as being Islam-like rather than Islamic or practicing Islam? I ask because I was struck by your description of the variety of Islams practiced in West Africa between the 15th and 19th century. So given the Africana Muslims' diversity of religious experiences, what do you think is useful, or maybe not useful, about ideas of orthodoxy and heterodoxy when talking about Africana Muslims?
So this is a let me just go back to what you mentioned before, and
Mhm.
then I'll come back to this question,
Yes.
this most recent question. Very quickly. These kinds of choices were not only being made in the Americas, they were also being made in West Africa.
Mm.
In the face of colonialism. And there were at least two responses to French colonialism in Senegal, you will recall.
Mm.
El Hajj Omar, El Hajj Omar took up the sword and he fought the French. That was his response. Amadou Bamba did not. Amadou Bamba had a different approach. His approach was resistance, but it was not a kinetic response to the
Right.
French. All right. And he is the founder of the Muradia.
Mhm.
And so the idea was it was a kind of resistance, a spiritual kind of resistance from within.
Mhm.
And the argument is that actually Amadou Bamba's position was the better approach. Okay. So I can't enter into which was right or wrong or
Right.
better or inferior, but my point is that even in the continent, Muslims disagreed on how to deal with this imperial presence. Now, here we're getting into a kind of sticky wicket. The context is that um, we have an Islam in West Africa that is heavily Sufi, which is in and of itself not accepted by everybody in the Dar al-Islam. As a matter of fact, it's heavily criticized in portions of the Dar al-Islam. And everybody, you don't have to be a Salafi to criticize it, but I mean, and there's Salafis and
Mhm.
there's Salafis. I understand that. So that's the kind of groundwork that makes this a really, really difficult thing. So if we take, for example, the Nation of Islam, all right, through which Malcolm moves. Um, during the period and subsequently after Elijah Muhammad's passing, there were many in the Muslim community who did not accept the nation. All right. So I don't know how to, and maybe people can help me with this. I don't know how to, that's why I use the term Islamic-like, or maybe Islamic-cate, or something like that. I'm trying to, so I am not trying to say, by any stretch of the imagination, who is Muslim, who is not Muslim. That's not what I'm trying to say. I guess what I'm trying to do here is to recognize that there's a divergence of opinion and perspective on this. Yeah,
Okay.
that's all I'm trying to do.
Right, yeah, yeah.
All
I think
I'm
that's, I mean, yeah, I'm sorry, yes, go ahead. Yeah, I mean, that's great. And I think that's a great point for us to sort of end the keynote and invite people to come back to join us at 1:30 for the panel, where I know this will come up again, right? Like this question, because I think this question of heterodoxy, orthodoxy, and part of even what we're thinking about in terms of this question of African and Muslim and genealogies of white supremacy is the ways in which this experience, right, that Muslims of African descent have had across time and place is generative to be thinking about these kinds of questions, which are not just Africana questions, not just Muslim questions, right? But this idea of how do we sort of hold multiple things at the same time, right? That people are identifying ways, but there are debates, there are conflicts, right? Like, how do we understand that? So I want to thank you so much on behalf of everyone, Dr. Gomez, for this amazing presentation. If you missed any of it, it will be on YouTube. We will post this on YouTube, and we invite everyone to come and join us again at 1:30 for the panel where Dr. Gomez will join us also. We have our panelists are Margarita Rosa, Nathaniel Matthews, Jason Young, and with comments by Dr. Aaliyah Khan and Dr. Michael Gomez. So see you folks again in about 20 minutes or so. All right, thank you.